The year is 1961. The sun hasn't risen yet over the Sirkechi train station in Istanbul, but the air is already thick, not with the salt of the Bosphorus, but with the heavy, suffocating scent of cheap tobacco, sweat, and unwashed wool. Thousands of men, their faces etched with the rugged, sun-baked geometry of Anatolian life, stand in a line that seems to stretch into the very soul of the city. They are waiting for a stamp, a piece of paper that promises a future in a land they only know from grainy black-and-white newsreels and the whispered legends of Almanya. These are the misafirlar, the guests. They're carrying cardboard suitcases tied with twine, containing a spare shirt, a photo of a wife they might not see for years, and a handful of dried nuts or a piece of home-baked bread that will be stale long before they cross the border. They believe they are going to build a life. In reality, they are going to rebuild a continent that had spent the last decade trying to commit suicide. Imagine standing on that platform. The steam from the locomotive hisses like a warning, a metallic scream echoing through the vaulted ceiling. The cold German wind is already blowing in your mind, thousands of miles away. Would you step onto that train if you knew that the welcome sign was written in disappearing ink? Would you go if you knew that your children would eventually forget the language of your prayers? Would you stay if you knew that guest was just another word for ghost? To understand the guest, we must first understand the host. In 1945, Europe was not a continent, it was a crime scene. From the scorched ruins of the Reichstag to the hollowed-out shells of industrial Essen, Germany was a landscape of Trümmer, rubble. This was Stunde Null, hour zero. The clock had stopped. The Wirtschaftswunder, or the economic miracle, is a term we use today with clinical coldness in history books, but in the late 1940s it looked like a fever dream. Germany had the blueprints. It had the American dollars from the Marshall Plan, the green blood of capitalism injected into a dead body. It had the silent, brooding ambition to rise again, driven by a deep national shame. But it had a devastating, invisible wound. It had no men. Millions were buried in the permafrost of the Soviet Union. Millions more were returning as Heimkehrers, shattered soldiers with missing limbs, their spirits broken by the horrors of the Eastern Front. The rubble women, Trümmerfrauen, had cleared the streets with their bare hands, brick by scorched brick. But the heavy furnaces of the Ruhr Valley required more than just survival. They required raw industrial muscle. The gears of the Krupp and Tyson factories were silent. The coal mines of Gelsenkirchen were filling with water. A terrifying question began to echo in the halls of the temporary capital in Bonn. Can a nation be resurrected if its heart has stopped beating? This wasn't just about economics. It was about the Cold War. The United States, having watched the Iron Curtain fall across Europe, was terrified. If Germany remained poor, it would turn red. If the factories stayed silent, communism would find a home in the hungry bellies of the German workers. Washington pressured Bonn to look south. Turkey was the gatekeeper of the East, a vital NATO ally standing between the Soviet Union and the Mediterranean. By taking Turkish workers, Germany wasn't just getting labor, it was helping to stabilize a strategic ally. It was a deal signed in blood and oil. The guest worker was a soldier in the Cold War, armed not with a rifle, but with a shovel and a lunchbox. But as the first agreements were signed in 1961, a hidden conflict began to brew. The German government didn't want neighbors, they wanted hands. They didn't want cultures to mix, they wanted the machines to run. And they were about to implement a system of selection that felt uncomfortably similar to the dark years they had just escaped. Before the train, there was the examination. This is the part of the story usually left out of the brochures. Imagine a cold, sterile room in Istanbul or Ankara. The
The smell is an overpowering mix of rubbing alcohol, floor wax, and the primal scent of fear. You are told to strip. You stand naked in a row with 50 other men, your dignity left at the door with your shoes. German doctors, their faces as impassive as granite, move down the line. They aren't looking for human beings, they are looking for human engines.
They check your teeth as if you were a horse at a village fair. They thump your chest with a rhythmic thud, thud, listening for the slightest rattle in your lungs that might signal tuberculosis. They look at your hands. They want calluses, not soft skin. They want the hands of a man who has wrestled with the soil, not a man who has held a pen. When the cold metal of the stethoscope touches your skin, it feels like the first kiss of the German winter. You are no longer Ahmed from Sivas or Mustafa from Izmir. You are case number 402. You are a biological asset, measured by your lung capacity and the strength of your grip. If you pass, you get the Gesundheitszeugnis, the health certificate. It is your golden ticket out of poverty, but it feels like a branding iron. The journey on the Sirkeci-Munich Express was a 3-day descent into a different reality. The rhythm of the tracks, clack, 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 becomes a hypnotic mantra, a countdown to the end of everything you know. Through the windows, the lush greens of the Balkans and the familiar minarets of the East give way to the gray, jagged indifference of the Alps. The air in the carriage becomes a toxic fog of Birinci cigarette smoke, and the smell of sucuk and hard-boiled eggs being shared among strangers. Total strangers become brothers in those 72 hours, bound by the shared terror of the unknown.
By the time the train pulls into Munich's Hauptbahnhof, the men aren't just tired, they are culturally deaf and dumb. They step onto the platform, and the silence of the German crowd hits them like a physical blow. No one is cheering, no one is waving. There is only the sound of a loudspeaker barking orders in a language that sounds like the grinding of gears. Achtung, Achtung! The word vibrates in their bones. They have arrived in the land of the economic miracle, but the air smells like cold steel and wet asphalt. The German government was clever, or so they thought. They didn't want immigrants, they wanted labor units. To ensure this, they created the rotation principle. The law was a masterpiece of bureaucratic coldness. A worker could stay for precisely 2 years. After 24 months, he was to be packed up, shipped back to Anatolia, and replaced by a fresh, unexhausted unit. The goal was clear: prevent roots from taking hold. No families, no integration, no love. The workers were funneled into Haima, barracks that were often repurposed military camps or prefabricated wooden huts. Imagine a room the size of a garage, shared by 8 grown men. The walls are paper-thin, vibrating with the snores of exhausted miners. The only privacy you have is a curtain made from an old bedsheet. The floor is perpetually damp from work boots caked in coal dust. At 5 a.m., the whistle blows. It is a sharp, shrill sound that pierces through the fog of dreams. It is the same whistle that called their fathers to war, but now it calls the sons to the assembly line. The guests were ghosts in the city. They worked when the sun was down. They slept when the sun was up. They were the invisible architects of the skyscrapers they would never enter. They realized that training a new worker every 2 years was a logistical disaster. Why throw away a man who has learned the rhythm of the machine? Why discard a miner who knows the patterns of the rock? The factories had become addicted to the tireless, cheap, and disciplined labor of the Anatolian men. The miracle was a drug, and the guest worker was the supply. The law was quietly amended. The guests were told they could stay longer. The temporary was becoming permanent, but no one dared to say the word out loud. What happens to a man's soul when he realizes his temporary exile has become a life sentence? When he realizes that 2 years was a lie told to keep him working? By the late 1960s, the silence of the barracks was becoming unbearable. The letters home were no longer just about money. They were about the hollow ache in the chest. "Come," the men wrote, "bring the children. The miracle is real, but I am empty." One by one, the guest workers began to bring their wives and children. This was the moment of family reunification, the true climax of the saga. The German government watched in shock as the labor units suddenly revealed themselves to be human beings with hearts, needs, and traditions. The gray streets of Berlin, Cologne, and Frankfurt started to bleed color. Imagine the first time a Turkish mother hung her handmade lace curtains in a window in Kreuzberg. Imagine the smell of salsa, tomato paste, and garlic frying in a kitchen that had previously only known the smell of boiled potatoes and cabbage. Close your eyes and listen. In the markets, the sharp, rhythmic chopping of parsley on wooden blocks mingles with the high-pitched laughter of children who are learning to speak German in the morning and Turkish in the evening. The air is a heavy tapestry of roasting coffee, the sizzle of meat, and the metallic tang of the U-Bahn train screeching nearby. You can feel the vibration of the city in your chest, a city that was once divided by a wall, now being stitched together by the very people it tried to keep at a distance. But as the families arrived, so did the otherness. The guests weren't just in the factories anymore. They were in the parks, they were in the schools, they were in the cafes. The hosts began to look at them with a new, sharper suspicion. The guest was no longer a tool, he was a neighbor, and the neighbor was different. The world stopped. The OPEC oil embargo hit Europe like a sledgehammer. The economic miracle didn't just slow down, it crashed. The assembly lines stopped moving, the furnaces cooled. Suddenly, the guests were no longer the heroes of the miracle. They were the job stealers. The German government enacted the Anwerbestopp, the recruitment stop. The gates were officially closed. They even offered return bonuses, money to leave and never come back. But how do you ask a man to leave when he has buried 10 years of his youth in your soil? How do you tell a woman to go home when her children have never seen the Anatolian plains? The conflict turned bitter. The guests who had built the roads were now told they were clogging them. The tension moved from the workplace to the streets. Imagine being a child in 1980s Europe. You're a Deutsch Türke. Your grandfather arrived with a suitcase. Your father arrived with a hope. You were born in a German hospital. You dream in German. You love German football. But when you look in a mirror, the world tells you that you don't belong. You're caught in the in-between. At home, your parents expect you to be a traditional Anatolian child. Outside, your friends expect you to be a modern European punk. You're a bridge that people walk on, but no one wants to live on. The hosts began to speak of integration as if it were a medicine that the guests had to swallow. But the guests were already integrated. They were the foundation. They had paid the taxes that built the schools they were now told they didn't belong in. They had built the hospitals where they were now treated as foreigners. The Berlin Wall falls. The Cold War ends. As the two Germanys rushed to embrace each other, the guests stood on the sidelines, wondering, where do we fit in the new Europe? The reunification brought a surge of nationalism. There were dark nights, Mölln, Solingen, where the welcome of the 60s turned into the firebombs of the 90s. The guests faced their greatest test. They had survived the mines, the barracks, and the rotation laws. Now they had to survive the hatred. But here is the climax of the story. They didn't run. They didn't leave. They realized that they weren't guests anymore. They were the architects. They were the soul of the new multicultural Europe. The struggle moved from labor to identity. The guests became the doctors, the politicians, the filmmakers, and the neighbors. They took the economic miracle and turned it into a human miracle. Today, you cannot walk through London, Paris, Berlin, or Vienna without walking on the bones of the guest era. Every time you drive a German car, walk on a European highway, or eat in a bustling city center, you are experiencing the legacy of the man with the cardboard suitcase. The rotation principle failed because you cannot rotate the human heart. You cannot ask for hands and expect that a soul won't come with them. Europe tried to hire labor, but it ended up gaining a new identity. The Turkish influence, the Mediterranean warmth, the resilience of the migrant, these are now the permanent features of the European landscape. The trains still arrive, but today the suitcases are digital, and the guests are coming from different corners of a burning world. As Europe looks in the mirror, it sees the face of the 1961 worker staring back. But there is one secret about the 1961 agreement that remained hidden for 50 years. A document buried in the archives of the German Labor Ministry that suggested the guests were actually part of a much larger, darker experiment in social engineering. An experiment that didn't just aim to rebuild factories, but to replace an entire generation of lost Europeans. But what was the true cost of that experiment, and who is really paying for it today? That is a story for our next investigation.